And I would like to welcome to the show Adam Millsap, Senior Fellow at Stand Together. Welcome to Free the Economy, Adam.
Hey, Richard. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Now, just quickly as we start, give us a summary of Stand Together, the important organization you work for, and what your work there is as a Senior Fellow.
Absolutely. So Stand Together is a philanthropic community. I actually work at Stand Together Trust, which is an entity within the Stand Together broader philanthropic community that makes grants to primarily C3 policy organizations focused on expanding opportunity and empowering people, creating bottom-up solutions to some of society's biggest problems. At Stand Together Trust, I'm a senior fellow. I do some external writing. I write for Forbes. I'm a contributor there. I also write for some other outlets like City Journal, and things like that, as well as make grants. So I help hand out money to organizations doing great work on policy, ranging from fiscal policy, labor market policy, regulation, suspending tax policy, all the kind of economic policies that stand in the way of people self-actualizing and achieving their dreams and goals.
See, that I need that job because I feel like I would be more popular if I was handing out money. And when we say C3, so we mean 501c3. That's the IRS code for organizations that are
Yeah.
tax exempt organizations, nonprofits.
Yeah, that's right. So we give money to primarily to tax exempt organizations, is right. So there's also C4s and there's various tax statuses that do other kinds of things. We focus on the tax exempt educational entities rather than lobbying organizations.
Right. So, and you sort of led into this with your own description of Stand Together Trust. But so here at Free the Economy, we like to talk about where Americans can find economic opportunity today, but also how they can understand the flood of like economic and financial news that is coming at them, and sort of figure out what does this kind of mean for a normal person. Now, one good source of understanding all that stuff, I think, is your own column at Forbes.com, which has got some great stuff in it. So, for example, you recently wrote about tax reform effort in what I believe is your home state of Ohio. So we see, states are always, making tweaks to their tax systems here and there. But looking back at what Ohio is doing, what could those changes mean for people in the Buckeye State? What are they doing, and then what would it mean to like a normal person there?
Well, the biggest part they're going to be doing is simplifying the tax code. So instead of having right now, Ohio, like many other states, has a progressive income tax system where the rates change as your income goes up, the amount of tax you pay goes up. Other states have moved to more of a flat tax system where there's just one rate, and Ohio is trying to simplify its tax brackets, so decrease them and move to one tax bracket. And in doing so, it increases the incentives to work and invest, create jobs, create new businesses, and engage in more labor supply. So that's the idea there, is just to simplify the tax code and make it a little easier for workers and small businesses to keep more of the money they earn, have less of it go to the government so they can use it in the private sector to, like I said, invest more and create more jobs. There's some other things that are involved that are unique to the tax code in Ohio about how local governments get some tax breaks from the state government. When it comes to things like residential real estate and stuff like that. You saw a little bit of this at the federal level too, with the SALT and the state and local income tax deduction, right? So states also have similar kind of relationships sometimes with their local governments. And so they're trying to work out some of those nuances as part of their broader reform. But the biggest thing, the most pro-growth, empowering aspect of it is simplifying the tax code to make it easier for people to comply and also to increase the incentive to work.
And that's been a trend in recent times where a lot of states have been going. If you look at like the average tax rates have been sort of like declining down. So
Yeah.
You've had the consolidation and sort of simplification, but then you've had a lot of state income tax cuts.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of states have recently reformed their tax systems. When you think of like North Carolina was one of the first to do it. But since then, there's been a lot more. Nebraska recently did some tax reform. And you see more states even talking about doing it now. Arkansas, I think, is actively discussing. Arkansas and Mississippi at one point were actively discussing eliminating their income tax altogether, but I think they've made some smaller changes since then. Wisconsin is discussing moving to a flat tax or potentially eliminating its income tax to be more competitive with other states. When you think of Florida, Tennessee, Texas are well known for not having an income tax. They're also some of the fastest growing states. But I think states that still have very convoluted, complicated tax structures are trying to think, how can we modify our tax codes so that we can better compete with Texas and Florida and Tennessee for residents.
Yeah, and I think that's a sort of un maybe underappreciated aspect of this great laboratory of democracy we have in the United States, where we have a federalist system, we have 50 states, individual states, even though the federal government is sort of supreme with whatever rules they like to make for the whole country. That still leaves a lot of space for individual states to decide things like how high are taxes, how complicated are they, or who gets taxed for what. And states, smart states, I would say, are always competing both for residents and for businesses to come to their state. And so I know, having worked there in the past, the distant ancient past at the Tax Foundation, I know you and other some of our favorite economic pundits and writers have you know cited a lot of that research the Tax Foundation does, and so they do a lot of this 50 state stuff where they compare state by state, they rank them, and we know that state legislators, governors, and people who are interested in economic development in individual states definitely look at that. They look at that ranking. They look at where they are compared to all the other states across the country, but also the states that they're closest to. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone is going to move from like Hawaii to Maine, but someone might move from Georgia to Florida.
No, absolutely, and you're seeing that now. I mean, like California has lost a ton of residents over the last 4 or 5 years, really over the last decade, but the last 4 or 5 years, I think it's really ramped up. And you see them moving to Austin, Texas, and Boise, Idaho, even all the way out to California, or even all the way out to Florida and Georgia, like I said, places in the Southeast, Nashville, Denver, Colorado, just to escape the high tax burden that's out there in California. And to your point, not everyone's going to move from California to Maine, but a lot of people might move from Ohio to Indiana or vice versa, right? Or from Ohio down to Tennessee if Ohio doesn't do something to make its tax code simpler and more effective at raising revenue, but also not discouraging work and investment and things like that. So I think it's great. The Midwest has other things working against it as well, right? I mean, it's not known for its sunny days or its warm weather. It's nice winters, and so when you're thinking about, wow, do I want to move to Georgia or Florida? Or do I want to move to Indiana or Illinois? All else equal, you're probably going to pick one of those southern states where the weather is a little bit nicer. So it's really important for places like Ohio and Michigan and Illinois and Indiana, places that don't have some of those natural, nice geographic amenities, to really compete on the business side, things like tax code and regulation and things like that.
Yeah, and I think it's like the old phrase about going to war. You go to war with the army you have, not the army you wish you had. So every state is in a situation where it needs to compete, for residents and business development and jobs. And you can't, North Dakota can't make a beach like Southern California and Florida have. So you got to work with what you have, and
Absolutely.
and that's definitely one of the things that can be changed, and can be changed fairly easily and quickly, right? Because if you say like, well, one of the things that people really care about is schools, they want good schools. It's like, well,
Yep.
there are all sorts of, educational reform ideas out there, just like there are for other areas. But in terms of like, oh, well, we want to like, double our high school, or like cut our high school dropout rate in half. Well, that's going to be a long, complicated, expensive investment, right? In order to make a big structural change in the entire state's education system. But a state legislature can go and cut tax rates tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, like I said, people want education. People want our governments to provide some basic services, right? And so it's not to say that government's just to say, oh, we're going to cut taxes down to the bone, but it's like, what is the best way to raise the revenue that we need to provide these services? And also thinking really hard about how to make those services as efficient as possible, so we don't need to take a bunch of revenue out of the private sector, but actually leave it in the hands of the people who are creating the jobs and doing the work. And so I think, smart governments are going to look at both of those dimensions, right? It's about, yeah, we want good services. Let's provide those in the best way possible, the most efficient way possible, so give people better value for their tax dollar. And then once we've done that, we can then return those tax dollars that we don't need anymore back to the people by just simplifying the tax code, broadening the base, and things like that. So you kind of get a win for both. You get a win on both sides of it. You're improving the services, making them more efficient, but also returning money and putting it back in the pockets of consumers and workers. So, like I said, smart governments, like in places like North Dakota that don't have a lot of other, this is no offense to North Dakota, I've never actually been there, so it might be much nicer than I envision it. But given that it doesn't have a lot of other redeeming features like, nice beaches and warm winters and things like that, really competing on that policy side is one of the most important ways, North Dakota, Ohio, and Illinois can really try to draw in residents, right? Whereas like California, I mean, look at California. It's a basket case policy-wise, but people still want to live there because I hear that it's very nice in places like San Diego.
They gotta balance things out. I went to college in Southern California, and it was pretty nice. They do have the Peace Garden in North Dakota. That's a lovely place.
There you go.
So, okay, so when people do move to another city or state, they're going to need a place to live, and so we've talked about housing policy before on the show, including just last week with our guest Max Dubler, talking all about urbanism and YIMBYism and stuff like that. So we want to figure out how we can get to a position of housing abundance in America. So there's lots of houses, lots of apartments at all the price levels. People got a place to live. And so you've written about this, but recently we had just sort of a local here to like the Washington, D.C. area. Some local changes in Arlington County, Virginia, which is right across the Potomac River from D.C., as that's sort of a case study. What have they been up to recently in Arlington?
Yeah, absolutely. So Arlington just passed what's known as like missing middle reform. So missing middle housing is often considered things like duplexes, triplexes, and up to fourplexes, and maybe even like some 6-unit apartment buildings or something like that. So no, we're not talking skyscrapers here. We're not talking 10-story, 15-story, 20-story buildings with hundreds of units, but just smaller buildings that can typically fit on the same size lot as a single family home, but they just have more units. So, the building envelope might be a little bit bigger. And what this does, it creates, potentially 2, 3, 4 units at a place where there used to only be one. So it's a great way to expand the supply of housing without, really upsetting, what people are concerned about the character of the neighborhood, right? It's not going to look out of place to have a fourplex in a single family neighborhood like it would if you had like, a 15-story apartment building or something like that. The construction time is not going to be as bad. It's not going to be as messy, as dirty. It's not going to put the same kind of strain on local services, the schools or the roads or the water and sewer systems. So it's a great way to just modestly increase the supply of housing in a very incremental way in order to bring down housing costs in a neighborhood.
Well, yeah, and so this is one of those kind of like, it's called missing middle, but sort of like also policy-wise middle ground reform opportunities, where I think there's people who are worried about their quiet, pleasant, idyllic, single-family zoned suburban neighborhood, and they say, well, we don't want to be like Manhattan, right?
Sure.
I don't think most suburban neighborhoods need to worry about that. I don't think most people are. There's a lot of developers that want to build an 80-story high-rise in the middle of a suburban neighborhood, but we understand what they mean, right? They bought into sort of a neighborhood like that for a certain quality of life, certain pace of life. But this is one of those things that is sort of having 2 or 3 apartments that are smaller than a single family house on a single family lot is not a revolution and is unlikely to change. And of course, in an established neighborhood, all of these lots are not up for sale at any given point in time.
Yeah.
That's right. Most of them are people there. They're living there for like the 30-year length of a mortgage. In any already developed neighborhood, this is going to be a kind of slow, gradual change. And another one of these options here, I think, is what we kind of talked about it last week as well, is the idea that if you can upzone things that are right next to, say, transit corridors, transit stations, subway stations, and in those are often on main roads, those actually can be higher, and you can get even more density, and that becomes sort of a trade-off where if you have a bunch of suburban areas that are like not close to a main road, and all those people sort of, they drive to a subway station parking lot, and they park there and they go into the big city to go downtown.
Mhm.
If you build something that's much higher right on top of that, where there's already lots of traffic already, and that's like not an issue, then that sort of buys you time for all the people that are in the suburban neighborhood. You don't need to upzone any of that if you do it right where it's really in the highest demand and there's already lots of traffic in the first place, right next to transit.
Yeah, that's one way to do it. I also don't think people undervalue the idea of more density. When you talk to a lot of people, they long for the mixed use kind of neighborhood, right? Where there might be a corner grocery store, or like a corner bar, or like a restaurant, or something like that. Well, that in order to have those kind of amenities in a neighborhood, you need a certain amount of density. You can't just have 10 single family homes and then have a restaurant. There's just not going to be enough patronage. There's not enough customers to sustain something like that, right? So a corner bar and a corner grocery store need, a certain amount of density that's going to require more than just single family homes to be within walking distance of this place. So having, 10, 12 apartment buildings, 6 unit apartment buildings, duplexes, fourplexes, things like that, mixed with some single family homes on small lots, that might be able to support something. And like I said, people want those neighborhoods. When you talk to people, I often talk to people that are from the suburbs like I am growing up, right, where everyone drove everywhere. And they'll say, "Oh, I love going to Charleston. It's so walkable." Or, I love going to like Arlington, for example, taking a visit because I can like walk to neighborhoods and restaurants, bars and things like that when I'm like in my hotel. And I'm like, you can have that in your own neighborhood too,
Mm-hmm.
if you actually, loosen up the zoning a little bit so people could build that world.
Well, yeah, and obviously you need sort of a mix of like residential and commercial. You need to be able to like you need the density first, but then be able to like permit
Yeah,
the like exceptions to the retail exceptions in a mostly residential
absolutely.
neighborhood. So look, America, if you want hipster brew pubs that you can walk to, we now have the solution. We need to lobby for that. So uh we love housing abundance. Absolutely. We also love energy abundance and affordability. Both of those are big parts of what we call the abundance agenda. So the energy part is a little bit more complicated. It's a little less intuitive for normal people, because people often go tour multiple houses or they look at multiple apartments before they buy, before they sign a lease. But most people don't take multiple tours of electric generating power plants before they turn the lights on. Uh, but given that stable and affordable energy supplies are pretty important, to our way of life, uh, why is it that we seem in this country to be having government policy that's making it harder rather than easier to build a new energy capacity? Like, what is make it make sense, Adam?
I mean, I don't know exactly why. I think for most people, maybe it just hasn't hit them yet. I mean, energy, I don't think, during this spike, during the Ukrainian war and the COVID, energy spiked a little bit. But I think prior to that, in most places, people just didn't really notice their energy bills being, I guess, particularly high. Now, I know there are places that are more expensive than others when you look at different cost indices of energy. But I don't know. I think a place like in Virginia or Ohio, where I'm from, it's not like a lot of my family members in Ohio are complaining about energy prices. A lot of people I know here aren't complaining about energy prices. So I don't think it's really hit us yet. But I think as we start transitioning and people start thinking about what does the grid of the future look like, and we start plugging in, 80 million cars into the electric grid, or we start realizing that, hey, maybe global energy supplies are a little more fragile than we thought prior to the Ukrainian war, that we're going to start to think really hard about, okay, what can we do to increase the supply domestically so we don't necessarily have to rely on some of these alternative sources? So I think it's really starting to hit home for people now. And only now are people starting to realize, holy crap, it's really hard to build stuff in this country. Forget about just like opening up a new nuclear plant or something like that. It's hard to just build solar panel farms and wind farms and to run new transmission lines and to build new just power when you think the big transformers and stuff like that. It's just hard to build any of that kind of stuff now. And so I think we're just seeing how fragile the country's electricity grid really is. And so hopefully that'll spark some changes and we'll actually get some momentum to change that.
Well, yeah, I think that's one of those things that we've I've certainly talked about before. Sure, we mentioned it on the show before, but that still doesn't seem like it's sort of like trickled down to everyone's kind of understanding, which is that we have these laws, these environmental laws, like famously the National Environmental Policy Act from around 1970 or so. It's been with us for a long time, and plenty of other laws at the state level, like California has its sort of own version of that, um, that that says the general understanding is like, if you're going to do some big project, you have to like study the environmental impact and make sure it's not too terrible, or come up with some way to make it less terrible, or, explore alternatives, that sort of thing. And so a lot of people have, for a long time, have said like, no, that's such a great law. Thank goodness. Because otherwise there would be all these big, dirty, terrible industrial projects all over the place. And, we'd have, way worse pollution. But that sort of mentality in those laws came from a time when everyone assumed, especially environmentalists assumed, that any new big construction project was bad, that it was basically just pollution, or that it was some greedy company wanted to make a bunch of money, so they're going to like dump a bunch of poison in a river, so we have to like stop them from doing that. But now, not even from a sort of like libertarian anything goes perspective, but even from the Green New Deal environmentalist perspective, in order to get where we want to go, so if we want to get to a less greenhouse gas future, a net zero future, we need construction. We need big stuff being built. We need these big projects. Solar, wind, nuclear, hopefully, maybe even
geothermal, and
cleaner natural gas than coal, whatever it is.
Yes, yeah.
But in order to do all that, you need construction. You need big projects. You need stuff that can get a permit and actually get built, and including, like you said, all the transmission lines. We've got more stuff is going to be electric now. Well, that the power needs to get to the stuff, right? But that is complicated, expensive, long, bureaucratic. And so you have a whole generation, 2 generations of people who are like, oh, well, thank goodness we have these like environmental laws that stop big bad guys from like, doing these big polluting projects. But those same laws are stopping the green projects from going forward. They're making solar and wind and nuclear much more expensive and slower. And so I feel like there needs to be a sort of like kind of head shift, vibe check, whatever you want to call it, to say we need to kind of reform this stuff, make it simpler, make these projects go faster, because even the environmental goals are not going to reach the finish line unless we do that.
Yeah, I think there's room there to talk about the environmental goals for sure, right? I mean, we the solar panels and the wind farms, like I said, the geothermal, hopefully nuclear. I'm a fan of all these energy sources, and it seems like nuclear with the small modular reactors is potentially going to bring the cost down and make it pencil more so than it potentially does now. But it's not just, to your point, it's not just the green or the zero emissions energy sources that we need. It's also going to be natural gas for their foreseeable future for a lot of things, right? We know the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. And so you need energy sources that can be ramped up and then wound down on demand as the grid requires it. And right now, we don't have the battery technology. We don't have the transmission lines to create a world where we can just store all the energy, all the solar and wind in batteries, and then turn it off and on whenever we need it. We just don't know how to do that right now. It's just not feasible. So we're going to need natural gas. We're going to need some of these kind of other, on-demand sources. And so I think we just got to be careful. I worry sometimes that we can't be making too many compromises that, hey, we're just going to have better permitting or easier permitting for, green energy sources.
Right, exactly.
No, we need easier permitting for pipelines and stuff too. So I think it's important that policymakers recognize that and they're just honest with the American people. We might get to a world. Listen, I'm all for a futuristic world where everything runs on electricity and that we all have little batteries everywhere, right? But that's probably not happening in the next 30 or 40 or 50 years. So for the next 2 or 3 generations, we're going to need more fossil fuels to complement whatever kind of green energy we can hook onto the grid.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was just at this fine event over the weekend, the Econ Twitter in Real Life conference. A lot of people got together for, and so that was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So you had people drive up from DC and drive down from New York. So I was on the bus for 2 hours with all these other kind of like econ policy nerd people like myself. And this is exactly one of the conversations we had on there, which is we've got, like we said, we've got this very complicated and expensive system for permitting new projects, stuff like construction of power plants. And then some people said, well, we should make it easier, but only for renewable projects. Well, then you have sort of a carve out, and then you've got this like a separate system that's like slightly liberalized, that's like cobbled onto the existing system in this sort of like weird kind of Frankenstein way. But that only makes the entire process even more complicated. right?
Yep.
Because then you have to figure out, oh, am I the old system or am I the new system? Or if I like write my proposals, 10% different, can I get grandfathered into here or in there? And so even though, I mean, I'm trying to make the most sympathetic possible case for it, but in general, what we want is a comprehensive reform to make stuff simpler and easier and cheaper to do, to actually build important stuff that is going to benefit people that we need, not just to say, oh, well, we'll let you get out of 25% of the bureaucracy if you check these 7 out of 12 boxes, because that just makes everything even slower.
Yeah, exactly. Just creates more distortions, right? And also, it's sometimes it's ignoring the crux of the problem. So think about mining, right? We're talking about we want to build more batteries and everything in this country. We don't want to go to China, which right now dominates both the mining of a lot of the minerals that you need and the refining of those minerals. So if we want to create more, mine more nickel and silicon and lithium and cobalt and all this other stuff you need in order to create batteries and solar panels and things like that, you got to actually permit some mines. I mean, we don't even let anybody build any mines in this country anymore. Again, it's dirty, it's resource intensive to start a mine. I get all that, but if you want to live in a world with American made batteries and an American made electric grid, you got to actually produce the raw materials in America too. And I don't see a lot of enthusiasm among the environmentalists for that very real thing that needs to happen.
Yes, I mean, maybe some of our friends in the eco-modernist movement. I'm thinking back to our previous podcast guest, Alex Trembath, and his colleagues at the Discovery Institute, the Breakthrough Institute. Sorry, the Breakthrough Institute. But yes, that's a good point. And I think we probably both of us have made this before. When people think about renewable energy, they think about sometimes they think about water because of hydropower, of a very old, proven renewable energy source. But they think about like wind and solar. They're like, well, it's just you don't have to burn dirty coal. You just have to like let the sun shine. It's like, well, sort of. You have to let the sun shine on solar panels that are made in a giant factory in China that are filled with minerals that have been dug up out of the earth and processed, right? So it's not just the sun rays and moonbeams, right? There's a lot of like industrial process behind that before it can turn into energy.
Absolutely. Mark Mills is one of my favorite guys who writes on this. He's at Manhattan Institute and Northwestern University. He writes a ton of stuff on this kind of idea about the amount of raw materials it would take to create the energy grid that a lot of the environmentalists and progressives want. And it's astronomical. And it's one of those things where we should have gotten started, 10 years ago. But the best time to start is today. The second best time to start is today, since we didn't get started 10 years ago. And I just really don't see that, the sense of urgency among the people who say they want to live in this world. So I would just love it if they would come to grips with reality and we'd start seeing them say, hey, you know what? You're right. Let's start creating some mines. Let's start digging up some of these rare earths and creating solar panels here in Michigan or Illinois or Nevada, wherever the heck you want to make them. But that involves putting shovels in the ground.
Mm-hmm. Look, you gotta deliver the lithium one way or another. If you want to make 100 million batteries full of lithium, it's got to come from someplace. The replicator's broken, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
So, also on the topic of sort of reforming the system so things are sort of like work better in general, go back to taxes. And I think we have kind of a fascinating conflict here. So it's kind of like the one with regulation about housing and energy, in the sense that we think housing and energy are really important, so we pile all of these like rules and regulations on them, but that only makes it harder for us to get the underlying good that we want. So like the left-wing recommendation on taxes, the stereotype left-wing recommendation is that they should always be higher, right? So the government has more money to spend on everything under the sun, whether it's social safety net programs or environmental quality or subsidizing infrastructure or whatever. But higher tax rates generally depress economic growth, which means that the things that which is what makes the achievement of all of those things ultimately possible. So the question becomes, should we shrink the pie so the government can buy you a small slice? Or should we reduce government burdens so there's a bigger pie for everyone? Now, obviously, when I put it that way, it seems like the answer is probably obvious, but there seem to be not enough people acknowledging that tension relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a very static view of how the government should extract resources from the private sector, right? Everyone says, oh, if the government raises tax rates today, they take more money today as a percentage of GDP or whatever, and that's true. But you also depress growth. I mean, there's a lot of good evidence tying high taxes to slower economic growth. I don't need to repeat it all here, but it's trust me, it's out there. I recently wrote about it in Forbes, and I don't think any serious economist denies that if you increase the tax rates on investment and capital gains and on income, you're just going to get less growth. Maybe we can debate maybe that's worth it, but it's going to happen. But in the long run, if things are growing at 3% a year instead of 2% a year, or 2.5% per year instead of 1.5% per year, then the economy is going to grow much faster, and even taking a smaller share of private sector economic activity away in taxes is going to lead to more actual resources, just because you're going to be taking it, to your point, from a bigger pie. And so I think the left sometimes undermines their case for government intervention or for the government providing resources by not being fans of economic growth. It's the golden goose. And if people who are in favor of the government doing more should be in favor of economic growth, because that's in fact what gives the government the ability to do more, because they're taking resources from a growing pie. And so, like I said, economic growth should be something that both progressives and conservatives and libertarians and Green Party or whoever, they should all be fans of it. And what we should be quibbling over is what to do with the resources that we get, not with potentially, killing that golden goose because we're trying to extract too much today.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those things where, like I said, we're trying to like make sense of all this like economic and finance stuff for people who don't like spend all their time thinking about it. And one of the things that I think is a little confusing to people, or like kind of misunderstood, is when it comes to statistics about growth, the numbers seem fairly small, right? And so it always seems like it's not that much, right? If it's even, and I think it was Mick Mulvaney who made this point. Has probably said it in 100 speeches, but when you're moving, say we have an economy that's growing at 2% a year, and we which is like more than I believe the economy is growing right now, but we say we're really optimistic and we want to get it to 3% a year. So we want economic growth to go from 2% to 3%. And so I think a lot of people would look at that and say like, well, that's just 1% difference. What difference does that make? It's like, well, no, it's not a 1% difference. That's a 50% difference. Right.
Yeah.
And when you apply that to the entire US economy, which is like vast and the biggest economy in the world, that actually means a huge difference in well-being for people all across the country. So that I think is one of the things that I think it's worth kind of like pointing out, that even when the numbers in certain cases, I mean, sometimes the numbers are really huge and they're so, it's like, oh, we spent $2.7 trillion on XYZ. Well, that number is so much bigger than anything that a normal person has to like deal with in their life, that kind of like they sort of get numb to the, amounts of money that big. But I think the opposite is true sometimes in things like economic statistics and things like growth, where, that like a 1% difference doesn't sound like much, but it actually really is.
Yeah, especially it's just the compounding nature of growth, right? I mean, one percentage point difference make a huge difference in the long run. And, when you think about 2% versus 3%, that's like the difference in the economy doubling every 36 years if it's 2% versus every 24 years if it's 3%. Again, that doesn't seem like, okay, 36, 24, 12 years, maybe that's not such a big deal. But if you think of doubling in 72 years, doubling twice, you go from 10,000 to 20,000. But if you can double 3 times, you go from 10,000 to 20,000 to 40,000. Right. So now you're talking that incomes are actually twice as high at the end of a 72-year period, 40,000 versus 20,000, than they would be otherwise. And for people, that's a really big deal. The incomes being twice as large as they would have been otherwise. So as much as it's hard for people to understand that, but I think that behooves people like you and I then, and the people on our side who are in favor of economic growth, or the pro-growth people, to consistently point this out to people so that they can see how big of a problem it is. It's kind of one of those unseen things. No one sees the economic growth that we didn't get, and so it's easy just to not worry about it and not really appreciate it. But I think that's just on us then to just keep repeating the message.
Well, yeah, and I think even over long time spans, there is something that like people have an intuitive connection to, because one of the biggest things that critiques people have about the contemporary U.S. economy is, well, are my kids going to be better off than I am?
Yeah.
you know, am I going to be able to like kind of pass off a better future, better hopes, better economy to my kids in the future? And that's when I, like if someone is like in college right now and they're really worrying about their first job, they're probably not worried about economic growth 40 years from now. But if, you just came home from, the maternity ward with your first child, you might be concerned about where the economy is going to be in 40 years because you want them to have a good, bright future. So that's one way in which I think you can say like, well, yes, even these numbers, they seem small at first, they compound over time, and they're going to make a big difference in the long run. And that is going to be the future your kids inherit.
Absolutely. And recognizing that if we live in a world of a stagnant economic growth situation, right? The only way for people to get ahead is for other people to fall behind, right? If nothing's growing, then everything's relative and you're just trying to find a better rank than the next person. Only when the economy is really growing and there's strong economic growth can everyone get ahead, can everyone do better off long term. And so again, if you're worried about your kids or you're a grandparent, you're worried about your grandkids, what's it going to be like for them 30 or 40 years from now? You should really favor economic growth. Otherwise, your grandkids are going to be fighting among their own generation for ranks in this very fixed economic system that we live in. And so like I said, I just think that's and you're seeing this in Europe a little bit right now, right? I mean, people in France are freaking out about the retirement age thing, and I don't think it's all about the retirement age. I think it's because Western Europe has just stagnated over the last 10 years. Their just economic growth is not very strong. When you look at France or in the UK, certainly down in the southern part of Europe, like Spain and Italy and Greece, I mean, some of those countries haven't grown for the last 15 or 10 years at all. And the U.S. could be in that same situation at some point if we don't really start re-emphasizing the benefits of economic growth.
Absolutely. Don't make your grandkids fight over scraps. Support pro-growth economic policies, friends. Okay. All right, Adam, this has been an excellent conversation. And before we go, though, please tell people where can they find you and your excellent writing on the internet?
Awesome. Yeah, it's been a great conversation. So like I said, I'm a contributor at Forbes, so you can find me on Forbes.com. I'm also on Twitter at AA_Millsap. I'm also on LinkedIn. I post a lot of my content there. And you can also go to the Stand Together Trust website, standtogethertrust.org or standtogether.org. And you can see all the good work that the Stand Together community is engaging in.
All right. Excellent. Well, thank you, Adam, and for being our guest here on Free the Economy. And we will have our eyes glued to Forbes.com for your next column going up.
Awesome. Thanks, Richard.